Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video we are going to go over the Nimzo-Larsen Attack, one of the most famous hypermodern openings, a great opening, a very flexible opening, and something in between an opening system and an actual opening, depending on how you look at it. So the Nimzo-Larsen is 1b3 or 1 knight f3 followed by 2b3, and I'm going to explain the difference. This is also the Nimzo-Larsen, although it can be many other openings. So the first thing you should know is that Nimzo-Larsen is not an opening on its own. You are playing it to get a certain opening on the board, an opening you like to play. For example, white can end up playing the reverse Dutch, white can end up playing the reverse Sicilian, or sorry, the Sicilian actually, just with white pieces. White can end up playing the Queen's Indian, white can end up playing the Reti, or we can get into some of the main lines. So it's highly likely that depending on what black does, you are going to have to choose an opening setup for yourself. Okay, the second thing is 1b3 is very, very dangerous for black. Why? Because most queenside fianchetto openings tend to be aggressive because you're pointing your bishop towards the black king. One of the main ideas is to play for the dark squares in the center, so this diagonal. And if you know the Dutch defense, for example, in which black plays f5, this has a similar idea. Let me just show you a simple structure that could occur. So for example, you have a bishop on b2, you put your pawn on f4. This is now a Dutch defense in reverse, depending on where your bishop is and depending on whether your g-pawn goes to g3 or not. It's either going to be a classical Dutch or a Leningrad Dutch setup, and it's a very, very aggressive opening. So as I said, black is playing for the dark squares in the center. With the bishop on b2, with very likely a knight on f3, and this pawn on f4, it's going to be very hard for black to contest the e5 square and the d4 square and the dark square diagonal in general. So that's why I think people should play the Nimzo-Larsen. You can get an aggressive setup like this. That being said, black doesn't have to oblige. Black's main response to the Nimzo-Larsen is 1e5. Once 1e5 is played, this diagonal has been blunted, your bishop comes to b2, but it has already been blunted, and black's main goal in most cases is going to be to keep control over the e5 square and not allow you to unleash the bishop on b2. Which brings me to my next point. Many people like to start the Nimzo-Larsen with 1 knight f3. Now, you shouldn't call this the Reti, because the Reti is a specific opening setup. 1 knight f3 is not the Reti. 1 knight f3 can be the Catalan, the queens can be declined, the London system, it can be anything. But you start with 1 knight f3 to prevent e5. Obviously, e5 now loses a pawn. Black has a number of moves here, like d5, which is what I play, or knight f6, or g6, or c5, or even knight c6. So, once knight f6 is played, now you play b3, or any other move for that matter. Why did we start with knight f3? Well, we want to go bishop b2 without allowing e5. Now, what's the downside of starting with knight f3? When we start with knight f3, we are preventing e5, but we are also blocking our f-pawn. So if you'd like to play the Dutch in reverse within the Nimzo-Larsen, I would recommend that you start with 1b3 and learn the main lines that I'm going to show you. If you would like a safer game, start with knight f3, play b3 on the second move, and that way you will have avoided most of the main lines. So I'm going to show you 9 most common setups for black and for white. I'm going to teach you the opening for both sides. Hopefully after this you'll have a very, very solid repertoire in the Nimzo-Larsen. And I'm going to specifically focus on what I play against it as black, because I think it's by far the best option. And that's the only chapter we are going to be looking at from black's perspective. Okay, if you would like to skip to a specific chapter, they are listed below. You can do that. And before we get into the actual theory, I would like to give you a brief historical context about the opening. So the Nimzo-Larsen has obviously been named after Aron Nimzovich and Bent Larsen, the two, well, I would say they are both among the 20 greatest players of the 20th century. In the 20s and 30s, Nimzovich played either b3 or knight f3, although knight f3 more commonly a lot. And he actually scored 80% with the setup, with the opening. So a great score. And then Bent Larsen played it a lot in the 60s, 70s. He also scored 80%, but there is a game he played that gave the opening a bad name. The game I'm about to show you. Now, this game is very brief. Before we get into the theory, I want you to know this game. This is the game between Bent Larsen with white and Spassky with black in the USSR versus the rest of the world match. And of course, Bent Larsen was playing board 1 for the rest of the world, which is strange considering that Bobby Fischer was by far the strongest player in the world at the time. But Fischer said, okay, you can play board 1. So in any case, Larsen starts with b3. Spassky plays e5, bishop b2, and knight c6. This is the main line today. c4, which isn't the most common way to play, but it's fine. Knight f6, knight f3, and e4. A very challenging line, but white has knight d4. And black plays bishop c5, double attacks the knight. Now, if you turned on the book here, you can see that e3 is a move, knight c6 is a move, knight f5 is the best move by far, and that's what he should have done. And you go knight f5, castles, e3, and the game goes on. He took on c6, dc6, unleashing the queen, e3, bishop f5, defending the pawn on e4, queen c2, a flexible developing move, queen e7, wants to castle queenside, bishop e2, castles. And in this position, there are a couple of normal moves, like knight c3 or a3. a3 is probably the best move with the idea of b4. But Larsen played the move that loses the game instantly, f4. f4 is such a bad move because it weakens the entire structure. You can never challenge the e4 pawn, so white's position will permanently be split in half. And worst of all, it allows knight g4. Now, knight g4 is a scary move because queen h4 check is coming. Bishop takes pawn is coming. What do? There's a rook on d8. How do you defend against this? I think that what Larsen did, played g3, isn't the best idea. If I turned on the engine, it says queen c1 is best, although it would be really hard to play queen c1, but g3 is among the best moves. Okay, and now Spassky plays h5. And what do? What are you supposed to do here? If you play h4, which is a sensible move in a losing position, then there is rook d3, and the rook just came in. Look at this position. So he didn't do that. He played h3, chasing the knight away, which is much worse. And now the winning move is h4. If you don't know this game, I'm sorry for spoiling it with analysis that isn't detailed. I just wanted to show you the dangers of the Nimzo-Larsen first. So what do here? If you play bishop g4, then bishop g4, you take back and hg3, and obviously the g pawn is rolling forward, the queen is coming to h4, you're about to get mated. So after something like rook h8, your best bet could be king f1, but now g2 check, and you cannot take. Oh, if you don't take, you lose. If you take, you lose anyway. Queen h4, and you're getting mated. So in the game, he played hg4. And after hg3, it resigns. If you take the rook, it's going to be mate once again due to queen h4. If you go rook g1, which he played in the game, it's mate all the same, but with a very, very, very extraordinary move. Rook h1, giving up a full rook. And the idea is once you take, I go g2. Now if you go rook g1, there is queen h4, followed by queen h2, and I just take your rook and mate you. And he played rook f1, giving up a rook, but Spassky doesn't take, queen h4, chasing the king away, and now takes queen, and Larsen resigned. This is just an extraordinary game, which goes to show that a hyper-modern opening isn't always a great choice unless you know the ideas very well. Okay, before we get into the theory, and we are about to start with the main line now, I would like to mention that I've created a repertoire on the Nimzo-Larsen for white. You can get it on Chessbook, and there is a link in the description. Chessbook is how I study openings. It's been my go-to resource for training my repertoire for about 8 months now, and I don't remember a tournament game I've played that I haven't prepared for on Chessbook. So I've prepared an entire Nimzo-Larsen repertoire pre-made, excuse me, for you to use. If you go to Chessbook, follow the link below in the description, go to your repertoires, and Nimzo-Larsen is an opening for white, so go white. Now you can start building your repertoire on your own if you want to play something other than the Nimzo-Larsen. You can import the PGN of a repertoire, which you can again find in the description below if you want to import it for the Nimzo-Larsen. And you can also select a pre-made repertoire. I've made an entire Nimzo-Larsen repertoire, everything you can see on the video, for Chessbook, so you can get that over there. You can also get my Hanging Pawns London repertoire. Excuse the typo, this is going to be corrected. The apostrophe should be behind the S. And I've made 2 repertoires for black, e4, e5, and the Queen's Gambit declined. So just select the repertoire, add to your repertoire, yes, add these moves, and now you will see that you can practice them, go to the biggest gap, and so on and so on. It says 41% completed because Chessbook insists on covering all the moves to have 100%. So for example, b3, f6 isn't covered because it makes no sense. And now you can practice those and just go to everything that's due for review. b3. You can skip first practice if you want. It's going to give you hints, but you can skip it. So I'm going to skip it. Yes, skip. So b3. And let's see, okay, against this we go bishop b2. If you don't know, you can get hints and stuff, and that way you go and build your repertoire. So if you'd like to check out Chessbook and get a pre-made Nimzo-Larsen repertoire, follow the link in the description. And now let's go back to the video in the description. So let's start. The main line. After b3, as I said, e5 is the most common move, and it makes the most sense. Bishop b2, knight c6, once again supporting e5. e3, white's idea is to play bishop b5, similar to what you do in the Spanish, when you play bishop b5 in the Roy Lopez to take the c6 knight and undefend the e5 pawn, just that now you don't have a knight on f3, you have a bishop on b2, but it's the same plan. Knight f6, bishop b5, and the main line may seem strange. Of course, you can play d6, and it's an okay move. And in most cases, when d6 is played, black is going to be playing a sort of King's Indian with g6, bishop g7. But the main move is bishop d6. And this is by far the best, according to the engine. The engine says black has a minus 0.1 advantage, so the opening for white hasn't gone well. The bishop seems awkward, but there's a very specific idea for this. You would like to eventually move your c-pawn to c5, put your bishop on c7, and then play d5 in one move, without having to waste the tempo on d6, without shutting in your bishop, and it's not really clear that c4, c5 does anything strong. White's response may surprise you, but it's knight a3, and this is a very, very smart move in this position, because the knight could be coming to c4, and in most cases it will come out to c4 and try to take this bishop. Also, playing knight c3 blocks your pressure on e5. And in this case, black has several moves. a6, simply trying to provoke bishop takes c6, knight a5, preventing bishop takes c6, and e4, which I think is a genius move. I think e4 is the best move. So, first of all, if a6, white takes, d takes, and knight c4. Black shouldn't move this bishop. Black would love to see cd6 on the board supporting the e5 pawn, so queen e7 developing, knight e2. And now there are a couple of options. You can play b5 as black, you can play castles, or you can play what I think is the best move, h5. If b5, you just take, and black takes with the c-pawn, and I honestly don't like that position for white that much. However, if b5 takes, black has a very fluid center, but white has his chances, and this bishop is still very good. f4 may come, d4 may come. It's a fine position. If castles, instead of b5, probably b5 is going to be played on the next move anyway. So what I think is the best idea here is h5. And white should take, c takes, d3, h4, just continue pushing. And at this point, white really should play h3. If not, then the pawn is coming to h3. That's going to be uncomfortable. So h3 and just bishop e6. And white has this problem on the king side. There's a pawn on h3. The knight has no squares for now, no good squares for now. And you constantly have to watch out for knight h5. So let me give you an example. If you castle, the h3 pawn is a hook. So a simple move like rook g8, g5, g4 would open up the position and white would collapse very quickly. In combination with knight h5, that's absolutely devastating. So you really shouldn't castle here. And there have been no games from this position, but I find this variation extraordinary. And I'm completely unsure as to what white should be doing. If you turn on the engine, it says queen d2, queen c1, f4. I like f4. But again, there's an issue. What happens on knight h5? What do you do now? Are you supposed to take on e5, win that pawn? I really don't believe that that works. If you take that pawn, then at least bishop h3 works. So yeah, I like that position for black. Again, it has never been played. So against knight a3, a6 is very interesting. And I would recommend that you play a6, b5, and h5 as black. As white, if a6 happens, do not castle kingside in those positions. Now e4 could be even better. I think I like this more. Because even though you're allowing this bishop to become open, white is going to have to play d3 or f3 at some point to break open the structure. But the problem is that we can always overprotect that pawn. So let's say knight c4, bishop e7. We're not giving away the bishop now. Maybe we play d5. Okay, bishop takes. In this case, b takes because, of course, d5. Knight e2. Both sides castle. And a5. And now again, white has a problem. a4 is a dangerous move. You don't really want to play a4 yourself because a5, the idea behind a5, or one of the ideas, is to give the bishop the a6 square. And if you go a4, you give away the b4 square. And you really shouldn't go c3 because then your bishop is dead. So d3, we have to get rid of this pawn. But for now, the pawn is defended. And black can simply continue a4. Now, you don't want to take this pawn. You want to do something in the center. So I think knight d2 is the best move, simply attacking the pawn. e5 would be slightly overextending, and also we could take on f6 and consider taking on e4. So black takes. And after c takes, just d6. And this seems very, very nice for black. White can win this pawn. If you're worried about that, instead of ed3, you can throw in a3 and provoke bishop takes f6, and then you can play, white plays rook b1, you can take on d3 next. But it still seems very, very nice. This outpost on b2 may not seem relevant now, but it definitely is. And also you've forced white to trade off the b2 bishop. So if I'm white, I'm giving up that pawn. Knight d2, c d3, d6, and excuse me, if I'm black, I'm giving up that pawn. So that's e4. I think it's a very, very nice position. The main line is knight a5. And knight a5 is a strong move because it doesn't allow bishop takes c6. Now, the bishop isn't really doing anything anymore on b5. In fact, it's going to run into c6, bishop c7, d5. So the bishop retreats. a6, maybe black wants to go b5, bishop b7. Maybe black wants to prevent bishop b5 and knight b5 in the future. Okay, so c4. Black castles, knight c2. And now this knight is not only supporting d4, but it's also supporting a3, b4. And if the e-pawn moves, and this is the most interesting strategic point, it could come out to e3 and f5. So this is a plan I really like for white. It doesn't always work, but it's an idea. So I think in most cases, white should play for d3, e4, and get the knight to e3. So rook e8, for example, d3, b5. Okay, we don't have to react, knight f3. c5, black is going to play his bishop c7 idea and play d5 in a single move. White castles, bishop b7, knight d2, playing for e4, bishop c7 and e4. Now you don't have to play e4 here, but we know that black has been preparing d5 since they played bishop d6. So e4 is positionally perhaps not optimal. I think the engine says d4 is better, but e4 plays against black's idea. And also with the bishop on b7, it's going to be tough to control f5 without playing g6. And if you play g6, well then f4, f5 may come and they have a target on g6. That being said, you can also continue with a3, b4, or you can play d4, which I think is the safest move. So the main line with bishop d6 is interesting, and I think both sides have chances. I would recommend that on knight a3, black plays e4. I think knight a5 is the least challenging for white. Okay, now we are going to go over the reversed London system. And this is the only chapter where I'm going to flip the board, because I would really like to call this the main line for black. Now, this is my subjective opinion. I have 1,000 online games in this system and probably at least 20 tournament games where I played the reverse London against the Nimzo-Larsen. Why is it so good? Well, it's good because it's flexible. It's good because it's easy to play. It's good because once you learn the plans, you can never be worse. And it's also good because the engine likes it. So we don't play e5, we play d5. We allow white to take this diagonal, whatever. We go knight f6, and again, white can play several different move orders, g3, e3, knight f3, even d4. Many things are possible, but e3 is the most common way to play. And now we just get the bishop outside of the pawn chain. And if you look at this, it's sort of a London against the Queen's Indian. And what we want to do next with black is secure that bishop. So after knight f3, you can play h6 straight away. You can also play e6. That's fine. Knight h4 doesn't really work yet because of bishop g4. Let me just show you that pattern. If knight h4, then bishop g4, and if f3, bishop h5, and if g4, we just go knight back to d7, and the knight's hanging with check. Therefore, our bishop is immune, and black has a great position. I've had this played against me many times. So we can safely start with e6. After bishop e2, knight h4 is threatened because we don't have the same pattern, so now we play h6. Once we've secured this bishop, we have to see what white does. We are just playing a normal London system. If you haven't seen my video on the Black London, look at that. I've made a whole video about this setup against every opening. You can find that in the openings playlist. So we play bishop e7. Why bishop e7 and not bishop d6? Because a bishop on d6 is a target, and if d3, e4 comes, which is highly likely, in many positions, then we don't want to run into a fork with e5. So if your bishop is on d6, you may have to lose a tempo. Another reason for having a bishop on e7 is so that after our knight moves, if white ever goes d4, which I've had played against me, you can then go knight e4 and bishop f6. And also, the bishop is controlling the h4 square. So against many fianchetto setups, supporting h4 is very, very nice. Finally, if white doesn't go d4, we will have the option to move the knight away somewhere and challenge the good Nimzo-Larsen bishop on b2. That's why the bishop goes to e7 and not to d6. c4, you go c6 automatically. If white ever takes, you have to decide what to do. My general rule is that if my knight is still on b8, I take with the c-pawn so that the knight can be developed to c6. If the knight is on d7, I take with the e-pawn to get a Carlsbad type of position. Let me just show you that, where white has a minority attack planned and I have a stronger center. But as I said, if the knight is still on b8, I will normally recapture with the c-pawn because I like having good knights. Okay, d3, castles, knight bd2, knight c3 is also playable, it's fine. Knight bd7, completing our London system setup, queen c2, bishop h7. Normally you play bishop h7 prophylactically so that you don't run into e4 with tempo, but you don't have to. And white can play several things. a3 is one of the most common ways to play, with the idea of bishop c3 and queen to b2 in some cases. We normally go a5. If white doesn't play a3, our plan is a5, a4, and we also don't want to allow an easy b4, so this is what we would do. And as I said, white has numerous moves here. Rook fd1, rook fe1, rook c1, d4 is playable, knight e5 is playable, bishop c3, as I said, is playable, many moves. Our idea will be, if the d-pawn moves, to challenge the e4 square. If not, I like the idea of going queen b8, rook c8, b5, and playing for the queen side. But that's going into the middle game plans already. So this is my preferred way to play against the Nimzo-Larsen, against the Reti, and against many other openings. It's a very simple system. Okay, next. Now we're going to have a look at an opening that has a similar idea to the reverse London. And the idea, of course, is get the bishop outside of the pawn chain before completing your pawn structure. It also starts with d5, and I like to call it the Pseudo-Trompowsky in reverse, although you could call it the Trompowsky in reverse, but without the knight on f3. With the knight on f3, if black plays bishop g4, that's a Trompowsky. Without the knight on f3, I still think Pseudo-Trompowsky is a more suitable name. So, white has a couple of options. Black's idea, once again, is to go e6 and continue developing, and the bishop isn't buried on c8. That's simple. White can choose between chasing the bishop away with f3 and h3, or just continue developing. I think playing f3 or h3 is too risky. I would never do that. You don't get that much, but let's look at those two moves first. First of all, h3. Bishop can go to f5 or h5. I like it on h5 better, but f5 is fine. And now white could consider g4, but that's too risky. The engine says black is already better. And this is an overextended pawn structure. It can easily be targeted with h5 later. Not that this bishop is bad. Your bishop isn't any better than black's bishop, so you may have knight f3, knight e5, or knight h4, but so what? If the h file opens, your pawn is going to be very weak. So I think if you do go h3, bishop h5, then just continue with knight f3. And you can argue that this is a tempo gaining move because black should take now on f3. And it is a tempo if you consider h3 a useful move in this structure, which I really don't. After knight f6, the main way to play is g3, e6, bishop g2, and now if black plays h5, then white should go h4. So playing h3 isn't really a tempo gain because you played h3 and then h4. Now black doesn't have to play h5. Black can play c5, knight c6. Black can play bishop e7. Black can play bishop d6. Black can play, I don't know, knight c6, knight bd7. There are many moves, depending on which structure black wants to play. But h5 is the only move that proves a point here. The point is that h3 wasn't a good idea, because now h4. I mean, if you don't play h4, if you, I don't know, castle, then I'm playing h4. And what do you do now? Because if I take this pawn, the diagonal is going to be permanently weak. If you take, then, okay, we don't have to look at that. Rook h4, knight h5, knight f4 is hanging. This is just dreadful. The bishop is out of play completely. So on h5, h4. And black plays g6, white castles, black plays bishop g7. I would take black here. I mean, your f-pawns don't look bad, but there's no reason for black to be less than equal. There's just no reason for that. So long story short, I wouldn't recommend that you play h3. And if you play this with black, don't be afraid of h3. Now f3 is slightly more aggressive. Again, bishop h5 is playable, bishop f5 is playable. In this particular case, I prefer bishop f5, and the reason is simple. f3 prepares e4, and you at least you want to win a pawn. So if e4 is played, not that this is too bad for white, but we are up a pawn, so that's why we play bishop f5. So on bishop f5, white really shouldn't go e4, e3 instead. And now my question is, once again, why is your pawn on f3? You would like to put that pawn back on f2. So e6, black now plays the London in reverse, and this you've seen in the previous chapter. The only difference is that white has gained the tempo to play f3, which, okay, I mean, I wouldn't do. There are a couple of ways to play this. You can play knight f6, you can play h6, you can play c5, you can play c6, you can play bishop e7. But in this particular case, I think the best setup is knight c6, and not going for the reverse London, but going for the reverse Jabava London. Because the knight immediately influences the center, and since white's pawn is stuck, you don't really need defending, you don't really need to defend d5 in advance. So I like this, but again, many setups are playable. And now play continues from here. Black can go h6, I like that. Maybe knight g3, the bishop retreats. Maybe bishop b5, pinning the knight, knight e7 defending, and so on and so on. So I also don't like f3 for white. So my conclusion is that you cannot really punish bishop g4 as white. You shouldn't go f3 or h3. That being said, f3 is the second most common move. h3 is the fourth most common move. What I think is the best move is g3. Just ignoring what black is doing, not allowing knight f3, bishop f3, and playing bishop g2 first, and then knight f3, and asking the bishop what it's doing on g4. Black should go c6, same way you play the reverse London. The bishop is coming to g2, so might be prudent to patch up this diagonal. Knight d7, knight f3. Now taking on f3 makes no sense because we have a bishop on g2. Knight gf6 castles, e6, and this is now, I don't know what to call it. It's just there's a bishop on g4 outside of a very solid pawn chain, and black has no weaknesses, but white has no weaknesses either. So I would say this is less ambitious than playing f3 or h3, but it's also far less risky. Okay, d3 for example, bishop d6. Again, bishop e7 is possible. I would debate that it's even better, but this is more commonly played, so I'm going to show you bishop d6. Black castles, h3, bishop h5, and now finally e4. And this is the King's Indian attack with the bishop on b2 instead of c1, so white has to play for e4. And the general rule is that when white plays e4, and you have this Caro-Kann/Slav/London system pawn triangle, when e4 happens, you play e5. It's almost always correct. You don't want to allow e5. And now white has many moves. This is a famous position, actually. Queen e1, the King's Indian attack, and just the play goes on from there. So basically, if black goes bishop g4, it's likely you'll have this position on the board. But you don't have to play g3. The final move I would like to show you is knight f3. And knight f3 invites bishop takes f3. I don't think black should take immediately, because if you take immediately, then gf3, and e4 is going to happen very quickly. So something like knight b7, continue with the same setup. If e3 is played, of course you don't take on f3. But if g3 is played, then you do take. And now takes, white obviously cannot recapture with the g-pawn because it's on g3. I like this. I like this for black because Again, doubled F pawns, they don't look bad, but they aren't that great either. After knight gf6, black again goes for the same setup. You can choose whether to go c6 or c5, whether to put the bishop on d6 or e7, then you castle, and white's going to go bishop g2 castles f4. White has the bishop pair, but the light squared bishop is going to be blunted because d5 is defended too many times. So I think that on knight f3, knight d7, white's best is to continue with e3 and just not allow that. h3, chase the bishop away. d3, play your normal setup. e6, knight bd2, and eventually we want to go g4, knight h4. If you know, I should also mention that Bobby Fischer started playing the Nimzo-Larsen in the 70s, and he had a perfect score, 5 out of 5. So if you have a look at his games, there's a famous game against Ulf Andersson where he played rook g1, g4. That idea is applicable here. Okay, so that was the reverse Pseudo-Trompowsky. Now the next chapter is very important, and this is what I think most people who play the Nimzo-Larsen face. So when black plays d5, but they don't go for bishop f5 or bishop g4, but instead they choose to play the main lines a tempo down. After e3, this is a Queen's Indian type structure. You can also call it the Dutch if f4 is played. You can call it the Nimzo-Indian. You can call it whatever you want. But black is playing the Queen's Gambit d4, c4 just with black, d5, c5, and going into mainline openings a tempo down. This is the mainline Queen's Indian, but black is a full tempo down. It's okay. Probably black plays d4, c4 as white, and they feel comfortable here despite being a tempo down, but I think this is a great opportunity for white. Not that the extra tempo is crucial or decisive, but still. There's one line I would like to look at first. When white plays e3, white's main idea is to go bishop b5 and to secure the e5 square. This whole position is going to be about e5. Since white hasn't played e5 early, they will have a hard time playing it, and in order to do that, they need to go knight c6. So bishop b5 is white's main idea. However, white can play a6. Now, I don't think this is good, but it makes sense strategically because you're playing for e5. Now you could argue that this is an Nimzo-Indian with a3, preventing bishop b4. But when you play it with black, it's too much of a tempo loss, I think. Okay, so white goes knight f3. Okay, it's also possible to go f4, which is what I would do. It's at this point that you have to decide whether you want to play the Dutch or not. If you feel brave and you have experience in the classical Dutch, by all means, f4 is a great move. So f4, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop e2, just playing a classical Dutch. And you have the normal attacking ideas. Castles, queen e1, queen comes to the king's side, the knight comes to e5. You can also go d3, e4. Instead of that, if you want to have a safer position, go knight f3. This is better according to the engine. Once again, knight c6 without allowing bishop b5. And in this case, I like playing the move d4 instead of d3 because I want to challenge the c-pawn. And I want to stake my claim in the center. So after knight f6, bishop e2 now, bishop g4, castles, e6. You can see that black is playing a Queen's Gambit. It's a normal Queen's Gambit opening, but a tempo down. And I think this is fine for white. So I don't think a6 is a good idea. Black should allow bishop b5. So knight c6, and white doesn't have to go bishop b5. White can go knight f3. White can go f4, playing the Dutch straight away. If you look at the repertoire on Chessbook, you will find alternatives to bishop b5. But I think bishop b5 is the best idea. Bishop b5 fighting for the e5 square makes the most sense. Again, think of the Spanish, think of the Roy Lopez. The pawn isn't on e5 yet, but by playing bishop b5, you're making sure it never gets there. So black plays bishop d7. I mean, you have to unpin that knight because knight f3, knight e5 could come. Knight f3, knight f6, white castles, e6, the bishop is bad, d3, bishop e7, knight bd2. This is the standard setup. Whether you have a pawn on f4 or on f2 is the main difference. Black castles, and I like the move bishop c6 here. So black didn't really have time to move the knight away. So since the knight is still on c6, we take it, bishop takes, and knight e5. And now we can play f4 on the next move. If you eliminate that knight on c6, f4 can come. Rook c8, black wants to recapture with the rook if the bishop is taken. And now there are several ideas. You can take on c6. You don't have to though, but I think f4 is best. And if black isn't careful, we will get a very, very dangerous attacking position, which is objectively bad for white. Black should have a small advantage, but it's really scary. So the best move is knight d7, challenging the knight. And you can respond by playing knight df3, which isn't great. Instead, taking the bishop is optimal. And now you just have a normal position. But if black doesn't play knight d7, whatever else they play, a move that makes a lot of sense is b5. That's one of the best moves. We can start a vicious attack by playing rook f3. It's very risky. If you turn on the engine, it's going to say minus 0.2 for black, and it's going to get even worse. But it's interesting. Knight d7, rook h3. Our idea is queen h5. Knight e5, queen h5. We can throw that in. g6 loses, of course. So h6. And now bishop e5. And black's best is to go f6, by far. And black should have a small edge. But this is still incredibly dangerous. I mean, the knight could come out to g6. So knight f3, h4, g6. The other rook could join in. On any d4, we have e4, so the bishop will be blocked. And even though the engine says that black should have an advantage here, I would take white, personally. All right. The next setup is very, very simple. What if black plays knight f6, g6, trying to fianchetto and parry our bishop and play a sort of Indian or King's Indian defense? Well, we just don't allow that. Bishop b2, if g6, take that knight. You take the knight. And this, for the same reason I didn't like white having doubled f-pawns, I don't like it for black either. There isn't enough compensation. And the pawn on b3 is the opposite of a waste of tempo, because you can now go c4. Bishop g7. Now we have to play the same way we play against the exchange Alechin. We have to get away from this diagonal, get away from the bishop. So knight c3, f5, and rook c1. Now we're safe. Now we can consider different setups. You can play with e3, you can play with d4, you can play with g3, which you think is best. And you just have a normal game where white has a better structure. So black castles, g3, d6, bishop g2, knight d7, e3, for example, c6, knight g2, knight f6, castles, rook e8. Now, this is the position you will get most of the time, and I'm going to show you just one plan. I think these positions are fairly simple to play because d5 can hardly be played. You can play with d4. You can, but I don't like that. You should go b4. And the idea behind b4 is to put your queen on b3 and play on the queen side. Now, let's say bishop e6, which makes sense. Queen b3 defends the pawn, and d5. You take that, c takes, and don't be tempted to play d4. Okay, d4 takes away squares from your knights. It doesn't allow you to challenge the knight on e4 if it should get there, and it doesn't allow you to challenge the e4 square at all. Look at these two pawns controlling e4. So just continue aggressively, knight f4. I know that that allows d4 by black, but that's not a big deal because your e-pawn is defended too many times, and d3 would just lose a pawn in the long run. So if d4, just take on e6, rook e6, and go knight b5. Now the pawn is hanging. If you advance it to d3, I'm going to go knight d4 and take the pawn. So takes, and takes. And now b7 is under pressure. Our f rook is coming to d1. This bishop has no targets anymore. I like this for white. Not that white has a significant advantage, but we have a better pawn structure and for the moment a better bishop, and we do have entry to the c7 square. If black blunders, we just go knight c7. Okay, so that's what happens if black plays knight f6 g6. Just take it. Now the next chapter is the Nimzo-Larsen against the Dutch. In my experience, people who play the Dutch want to play the Dutch all the time. Against the Nimzo-Larsen, unfortunately for them, it's very bad. If f5, white has an immediate advantage. Bishop b2, e6, the Dutch. Don't play passive moves. If you play moves like g3, knight f3, c4, e3, d3, black is going to get their Dutch setup and black is going to be fine. You want to challenge the f5 pawn before knight f6 is played. So e4. And if I'm going to be honest, there is no good response to this. Whatever black does, white is better. So as long as you go e4 on the third move, you'll have a permanent advantage. Well, unless you blunder later, but white is better. So let's look at the most obvious first, fe4. fe4 is almost losing. Queen h5 check. g6 is losing. g6 is just a blunder. I go queen e5 and I win the rook or the knight and the rook and everything. So on queen h5, the king has to go to e7. But now we simply go queen h4 check, the knight blocks, and we don't take the knight and take the pawn, that's passive. We continue developing. Black's king is misplaced. So for example, knight c3. d5 saves the pawn, g4. We want to go g5. If h6, we go g5 anyway, the pawn is pinned. Knight h7, d3, just continue developing. If knight takes g5, then d4, and black is basically losing. The rook is coming to d1. The engine gives this as +2. The best move is d4, actually. So fe4, definitely unplayable. That cannot be done. Knight f6, the most commonly played move, is also unplayable. And not because you take on f5, which is perfectly fine for black, because you play e5. And after e5, black is in trouble. If knight g4, then we simply go d4, and we are going to continue with h3 at some point. So that's not good. The engine says +1 already, but you can see that this is awkward. If knight e4, this is the best engine move, but it's still bad. We go d3, and now the knight gets chased away even further. Knight g5, we just play g3, fianchetto. What's the knight doing here? Why does black have a pawn on f5? Remember the Spassky-Larsen game I showed you at the start of the video? This is the structure Larsen had. That's why he lost. No good. So on e4, the only sensible way to play is to go knight c6. This is +0.7. Black is sacrificing a pawn because we take on f5. And once again, if ef5, black is completely losing. Queen h5 check. Okay, and once again on g6, we go queen e2 check. We take the rook. Black loses due to the same diagonal. If queen h5, king e7, which is better than g6, we now just take on f5. And again, black is busted. So on e4, knight c6, we take, and black cannot take back. Black has to continue developing. This is +0.5. It's okay for black, but after fe, we are up a pawn. In fact, the only way for black to stay in the game is to go d5 here and recapture with the bishop. So if this is the best black can get with the Dutch against the Nimzo-Larsen, just don't play the Dutch against b3. It makes no sense. You're down a pawn, you have a worse position. White has the best bishop in the world. So yeah, let's end it there. The Dutch, don't play the Dutch. I'm going to show you a move order with which black can enter the Dutch in a smarter way. In this chapter, we are going to have a look at lines that start with e5 and d6. So b3, e5. Okay, bishop b2. And instead of knight c6, bishop d6, which we saw in the main line, black plays d6. Now, this isn't passive. Black is trying to play either the Dutch or the King's Indian. And this is the way to get your openings. If you play the King's Indian defense or the Dutch defense against the Nimzo-Larsen, start with e5, d6, and then either f5 or g6, knight f6, and so on. So white goes e3. Now if you play the Dutch, play f5. Makes sense. And this I really don't have to show you. If you play the Dutch as black, you will know what to do. White should go d4. In my experience, if white plays something passive, then e4 could become a threat. So d4. And black's best is e4 still, claiming space in the center. So this is what happens if white plays correctly. White should also go d5 here and play for the f4 square. This is the way to challenge black. It's the only way to challenge black. If against f5 you play passively, then black is perfectly fine. There's just no debate. You can go for the normal setup, but this is just awful. Black is fine. Not that white is in trouble or anything, but you haven't challenged black's setup. And if black wants to go for the King's Indian, then knight f6, of course. c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, d4, and we have a normal King's Indian defense where black hasn't played knight c6 yet, or knight d7, so the e5 pawn is under fire. So black again has to resort to e4, but it's okay. Knight fd2, castles, and black is going to be stuck defending this pawn, but that's fine. So if you play the King's Indian or the Dutch, I would recommend that you go e5 on the first move, d6 on the second move, and then continue from there. The next chapter is on the reversed Sicilian. More specifically, the reversed open Sicilian. More specifically, the reversed, I may sneeze, excuse me, the reversed Scheveningen setup, oh, I really may sneeze, or the Khan or Taimanov Sicilian. So b3. If you want to play the reverse Sicilian as black, you can play e5 and then follow that up with d5. I'm going to show you how. If you play e4 as white, and you enjoy playing against the Sicilian, specifically against the Scheveningen, the Hedgehog, the Khan, the Taimanov, do this. Bishop b2, knight c6, c4, makes sense, knight f6, e3, and of course white could have gone g3 or knight f3, fine, but now we play d5 as black, and white's best definitely is to take cd, knight d, and this is the Sicilian defense. It's just that white is playing the Sicilian, black is playing e4. It's a normal open Sicilian. a3, so this is the Khan / Taimanov. For some reason there's a pawn on b3, so it's most likely going to be the Hedgehog. It's likely that white's pawns are going to be on a3 and d3, and it's going to be a standard Hedgehog where black can no longer play the Marozzi bind because there's a knight on c6. So I would recommend a3 to prevent knight b4. Bishop d6. There are other moves that are playable. Depending on what you do with e4 against the Sicilian, choose your move here. Bishop e3 is just best. Queen c2, white is playing the Hedgehog. Castles, knight f3, queen e7, d3, white is playing the Hedgehog. And black's most ambitious is to go f5. And you can see this is a very, very standard Sicilian defense. From here, there are many moves. I think white should go bishop e2 castle and knight d2, knight c4. That's the most challenging. You can get your rooks to c1 and d1. If you can, take on d6. And black should be playing for a6, b5. In some cases, just continue developing, get the knight out of the way, get the bishop on c6 to c6. So there are many, many ways to play this. I just wanted to show you this setup because it's interesting. If you play the Hedgehog as black in the Sicilian and the Nimzo-Larsen is your repertoire as white, then you're going to enjoy having a Hedgehog a tempo up. Personally, I hate the Hedgehog. I would take black here any day. Finally, this may be the most important chapter. I'm going to show you the reverse Dutch for white when black plays the classical setup. The classical setup meaning d5, e5, knight c6, knight f6. So is as if you're looking at a classical player in 1870 playing an early hyper-modern player. So e5. Black doesn't mess about, take the center, and yeah. Bishop b2, knight c6, e3, d5. Now, having the center, it looks nice, but white is going to try to undermine it. And the best way to undermine the center is to firstly put pressure on e5, so bishop b5. Black has to defend the pawn, okay? And now f4. And there are upsides and downsides to this move. Firstly, e5 is hanging, so black has the option to go f6. I think that's the best move. Black can also go queen e7. Black should never take, because you take on g7 and win the game. So there are three ways to play. Queen e7, f6, or the most aggressive queen h4 check, which is the main line. Queen h4 check, we go g3. The queen has to go to e7 because now again the pawn is hanging. And knight f3, the pawn is hanging way too many times, so f6. And white continues developing. Knight c3, bishop e6, supporting d5, which was now just attacked. And in this position, white should take on e5, because the e5 pawn has been undefended. If we look at the number of attackers, it's only 2, but we can unleash the knight as well. So fe5. Black, of course, recaptures with the pawn. And white goes d4. This is a scary position. And this is the only line in the Nimzo-Larsen in which I would recommend that you learn 25 moves of theory. But it's the only one. Literally the only one. Black can now play a piece sacrifice that requires a very deep theoretical understanding. It starts with pawn to e4. Once again, if you want to practice this, the whole repertoire is on Chessbook, you can find it there. If you turn on the engine, it says that e4 is the only move that keeps black in the game. The alternatives are ed4, which is much better for white after knight d4 because there's pressure on c6, or knight h6. Knight h6 makes sense, but not really. You're never going to really put pressure on d4 and e3. So let's just stick to what's good. e4. Okay, now why is this a piece sacrifice? Well, knight e5 by white, the only move that makes sense. And in this case, if bishop takes e5, white just has a pleasant advantage after queen h5, and the king moves, you take on e5. If the king goes to d8, of course, you take with the pawn, but still. So bishop e5, no good. Instead, black plays queen g5. And of course, c6 is hanging. So knight takes c6. And black's idea is to get tremendous pressure on the king's side in compensation for a temporarily sacrificed piece. If black knows exactly what they're doing, they're going to get an equal position and get the piece back. But it's very easy to mess this up. So now, of course, white is threatening to just move the knight and destroy black, so a6 has to be played. Bishop a4. And now black doesn't care. Knight f6 continues putting pressure on white's king. White's best is knight e5 check, against which c6 is played, not b5, because on b5 I can just take. So c6, and white is up a piece. In fact, white can, for the moment, remain up a piece by playing b4. Of course, black's threatening b5, so b4. Okay. But hanging the e-pawn, queen e3 check, knight e2, you have to defend, and knight g4. This is looking very scary. You have to take that knight, so knight takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Again, it's looking very scary. But queen d2. And there's a way to get the piece back. Queen takes d2, king takes d2, e3 check. You can take, I think that should be best. So king takes, castles, and now if you, I don't know, knight f4 seems sensible. Rook a8 check, king d3, and g5. And now you do lose the knight. You have to just let go of the knight. Because if you retreat the knight back, knight takes d5 is the best move. If you play knight g2 trying to save the knight, then rook f3 check, king somewhere, d2, and rook f2 check, and they take the knight anyway. So this line with d4, e4, if you don't know it as black, you're going to lose. If you do know it as black, it's going to be an equal position where you sack a piece and then get it back, if you know what you're doing. Okay, I hope this wasn't overwhelming. I wanted to do it all in one video so that you have a comprehensive guide on the Nimzo-Larsen, that you can see what to do against each and every setup black can choose. And I hope it was useful. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments or questions or want to say anything, comment below. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.